Right now, 85% of the global population lives in a system where corruption, inequality, and like elite privilege aren't actually bugs in the
All
system.
right, they're features.
Exactly. They are features. They're these mechanisms that are explicitly designed to stop society from, just collapsing into absolute bloodshed.
It's a very sobering reality.
Yeah. And if you are listening to this on a commute in a developed nation, you are living in a bizarre historical anomaly, like a fragile 15% slice of human history where things actually work differently.
It really is. And, we have this tendency in the modern developed world to look at nations that are struggling with instability or extreme poverty or authoritarianism, and we just diagnose them as simply broken versions of
Oh,
us.
totally. We assume they just need better laws, right?
Exactly. Better laws, a fairer election, maybe a bit more free market capitalism
Yeah.
to, fix the machine.
Right. We act like we're looking at an x-ray of a broken arm,
Well,
and if we just slap a cast on it, it'll magically heal into a functioning democracy.
but the framework we are looking at today argues that the X-ray machine itself is, well, it's fundamentally miscalibrated. We are entirely misunderstanding the disease.
Which is why today we are attempting to decode the underlying blueprint of human civilization. We are pulling from this massive, just deeply influential book called Violence and Social Orders.
Yeah, a conceptual framework for interpreting recorded human history.
Right, that's the subtitle. And it's an absolute powerhouse of a book.
Oh, it really is. It was written by Douglas C. North, who, by the way, won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on institutional history, along with John Joseph Wallace and Barry R. Weingast.
And what makes this framework so revolutionary, in my opinion, is that it forces economists and political scientists to basically stop sitting in separate rooms.
Yes, they argue that you cannot look at a country's economy without looking at its politics. Because both of those systems are desperately trying to solve the exact same terrifying problem, which is human violence.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because our mission for this deep dive is a really comprehensive chapter by chapter exploration of this entire framework.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It is, but we're going to do it. We're going to explore the three major social orders of human history. We'll look at the deeply cynical yet kind of brilliant math of how early societies prevented warlords from just slaughtering everyone.
Right, the doorstep condition.
Yes, those incredibly specific doorstep conditions required to escape that ancient system. And finally, we will try to understand why our modern attempts to, export democracy so often end in tragic, unintended civil wars.
And I just want to emphasize, this is an abstract theory. This framework completely rewrites how we should view modern foreign policy, global development, and even the very foundations of our own modern rights.
Yeah, it gives you a lens to understand literally everything, from like the Code of Hammurabi to why a modern foreign intervention fails.
So to get to the modern world, we actually have to start at the absolute bottom layer of the human condition.
The primal threat.
Exactly. The baseline constraint that every single society, from a tiny tribe to a sprawling empire, has to solve if it wants to see tomorrow.
Which is violence.
Violence is the core problem. And the authors point out that regardless of whether you personally believe humans are inherently violent or inherently peaceful, it actually doesn't matter.
Because all it takes is a few people, right?
Right. The simple possibility that some individuals will use violence to take what they want poses a central existential problem for any group.
So you don't solve violence by eliminating it.
No, you manage it. You contain it. And the specific architectural choices a society makes to contain that violence, well, they dictate literally everything else about how that society functions.
So they break all of human history down into basically three social orders. And the first one is what they call the foraging order.
The hunter-gatherer paradigm.
Right. It's the way human beings lived for the vast majority of our time on this planet. And we are talking about very small, very intimate bands of people.
Usually capping out around 25 to 50 individuals, maybe extending to 150 at the absolute maximum.
Which kind of lines up with Dunbar's number, right?
Exactly. Anthropologically speaking, permanent year-round settlements of more than a few hundred people simply did not exist until the Neolithic Revolution.
Which was roughly 10,000 years ago.
Right. So for almost all of human history, if you're in a group of 25 people, you manage the threat of violence through just deep, intimate familiarity.
Like, if we're in a tribe together, I know everything about you. I know you have a quick temper. I know your brother holds grudges.
I know who is sleeping with who.
Yeah, exactly. And that intimate knowledge is essentially your justice system. It's your police force.
If an apple goes missing, The group collectively knows who likely took it. Peer pressure, the threat of social ostracization, and, reciprocal altruism, they keep the peace.
So you just don't need a formal court.
No, because the social fabric is tight enough to absorb and mediate disputes on its own.
But the authors argue that this system mathematically breaks down the moment the population grows. There is this fascinating concept they pull from the anthropologist Roy Rappaport.
Ah, yes, the irritation coefficient.
Right. Which is just an amazing name for a theory.
It is. And the irritation coefficient is this brilliant way to visualize the scaling problem of human societies.
Because it's about the math of interactions.
Exactly. Rappaport observed that as a population increases linearly, meaning you add one person, then another, the sources of potential dispute do not increase linearly, they increase geometrically.
Because it's about the connections between the people, not just the people themselves.
Right.
Like if you have 3 people in a room, there are 3 distinct relationships. But if you have 10 people in a room, there are 45 distinct relationships.
And every single new node in that network is a new potential source of jealousy or miscommunication, theft, violence.
Which means you hit a ceiling very quickly.
Very quickly. You reach a population size where you can no longer manage violence just by knowing everybody. The intimacy fails.
Because you have strangers interacting with strangers.
Yes. And without formal institutions to step in, a society experiencing those geometric increases in friction, well, it'll just tear itself apart.
I want to pause on that for a second, because there is this pervasive kind of romantic idea in pop culture, the noble savage myth, that before modern civilization, hunter-gatherers lived in this peaceful, egalitarian Eden.
Oh, yeah. That's a very common misconception.
But the data the authors cite completely shatters that. They bring up skeletal evidence analyzed by researchers Richard Steckel and Jerome Rose.
And the forensic data there is incredibly grim. But it's vital for understanding why civilization developed the way it did.
What were they looking at exactly?
Steckel and Rose analyzed thousands of skeletons from the Western Hemisphere, dating back millennia. And they were specifically looking for human-induced trauma.
Not just accidents.
Right, not falling out of a tree. We're talking about perifractures on the forearms, from blocking blows, weapon marks on bones, caved-in skulls.
And what did they find?
They found that among pre-Columbian hunter-gatherers, an individual had a 13.39% expected probability of violent trauma.
Over 13%.
Yeah.
I mean, that means more than 1 in 10 people in those societies is walking around with evidence of a brutal, violent assault permanently etched into their bones.
It is a staggering level of endemic violence.
Yeah.
It's just a constant low-level warfare of raids, feuds, and interpersonal disputes.
Because the irritation coefficient has overwhelmed the social bonds.
Exactly. The disputes spiral out of control. But here is the critical turning point in the data.
Okay.
When Steckel and Rose looked at the skeletons from early, densely populated pre-Columbian cities, that rate of violent trauma plummeted to 2.70%.
Wait, that runs entirely counter to the irritation coefficient?
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, if you cram thousands of people into an early city, the geometric disputes should be going off the charts. The violence should be worse, not massively better.
And that is the million-dollar observation. Why did the violence drop?
Right.
It certainly wasn't a sudden biological mutation where humans became inherently more docile. It was an institutional mutation.
Okay, meaning what?
Meaning the structure of society fundamentally shifted around 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. Humans invented a new way to organize themselves that could actually scale past the irritation coefficient.
And this brings us to the second of the 3 social orders in this framework.
Yes, what the authors call the natural state, or the limited access order.
And this is the system that has dominated basically the last 10,000 years of recorded history.
Yeah.
From ancient Mesopotamia right up to modern dictatorships.
Correct. If you want to understand how early civilizations, those pristine states in Egypt, Mesoamerica, the Fertile Crescent, managed to build massive cities without modern police forces or democratic constitutions, you have to understand the core logic of the natural state.
So let's put ourselves in that position. If I'm a nascent king or a tribal warlord attempting to build a city, and I've got thousands of people generating endless disputes, how do I actually prevent my top generals and elite warriors from just taking whatever they want and turning the city into a bloodbath?
You build what the authors call a dominant coalition.
A dominant coalition.
Yes. The natural state does not try to stop violence by appealing to the better angels of human nature. It solves endemic violence by directly aligning the selfish economic interests of the most dangerous people in the society.
So they just buy them off.
Basically, the elites, The individuals who actually possess the capacity to unleash massive violence agree to respect each other's privileges because it is vastly more profitable than fighting.
Okay, what do you mean by privileges here? Because this sounds suspiciously like a mafia cartel.
It operates on the exact same underlying logic.
Mm.
The dominant coalition deliberately limits access to valuable resources.
Like,
They restrict access to land, to labor, and to capital. They also restrict access to valuable activities like long-distance trade, major religious functions, and large-scale organization. And by throwing up these artificial walls and limiting access, the elites create rents.
okay, for the non-economists listening, let's define a rent. It's not the check you send your landlord every month.
That's right. In economics, a rent is essentially an excess return. It is an economic privilege or a monopoly profit that you only receive because competition is artificially restricted.
So if I am the only person legally allowed to import salt into the kingdom, I can charge exorbitant prices.
Exactly. That excess profit is an economic rent.
Let's run with that mafia analogy because I think it perfectly illustrates how these rents actually stop violence.
It's a great analogy.
Imagine you have 5 massive crime families controlling a city. They all have hitmen, they all have arsenals. The potential for violence is massive.
Very high.
If they go to an all-out turf war, it's a bloodbath. But more importantly, a war destroys their ability to make money. The gambling dens close, the extortion rackets dry up because people are hiding.
War destroys the very wealth they are trying to capture.
Right. So the 5 bosses sit down at a table and form a dominant coalition. They divide up the city. Family A gets exclusive rights to the docks. Family B gets the sanitation contracts. Family C gets the casinos.
They are artificially limiting access to these markets to create massive economic rents for each family.
Exactly. And now, if Family A attacks Family B, they risk losing their incredibly lucrative monopoly on the docks.
The economic privilege itself becomes a hostage that enforces the peace.
That is wild.
It is a phenomenal articulation of what the authors call the double balance.
A double balance.
Yes. In a natural state, there must be a direct proportional correspondence between the distribution of violence potential and the distribution of economic power.
So the political system actively manipulates the economy to ensure that peace pays significantly better than war.
Exactly. The rents act as the glue holding the coalition of warlords together.
The book actually cites the work of political scientist Robert Bates here. He studied the newer tribes in Sudan and Ethiopia to look at how violence is managed without a centralized state.
Bates is fascinating. He frames it around the logic of deterrence.
How does that work for the newer?
Well, the Newers are a fascinating case study in fragile deterrence. They don't have a formal king or a police force. Instead, kinship groups hold collective responsibility for retribution.
So if a member of my group is killed or injured by a member of your group, my entire group is obligated to exact violent vengeance on yours.
Yes.
But wait, mutually assured destruction barely worked during the Cold War with highly rationalized state actors? If everyone is just constantly threatening blood feuds over stolen cattle, doesn't someone eventually snap?
That's the logical question.
How does the society not just spiral into a never-ending cycle of vengeance?
And that is exactly the vulnerability Bates identifies. Because the threat of violent retribution is omnipresent, actual violence is suppressed.
Yeah.
People are terrified of triggering a blood feud, so they behave.
The constant threat of violence prevents the act of violence.
Right. But a peace built purely on the threat of retribution is incredibly fragile. It is a balance of terror.
Because if a misunderstanding happens or a rogue individual acts out,
The whole system can cascade into a generational feud.
which is why the natural state is an upgrade. It takes that fragile balance of terror and layers massive economic incentives on top of it.
It doesn't just threaten you with a stick. It offers you a monopoly on the carrot market.
That's a great way to put it. And we see this everywhere in early antiquity. Almost all early civilizations were deeply theocratic.
Because the theocratic structure was an incredibly efficient way to generate rents. The priests and the politicians were either the exact same people or part of a tightly interwoven coalition.
They controlled everything.
Everything. They controlled the surplus grain, they controlled long-distance trade, and they controlled the religious rituals necessary for cosmic order.
And they used these massive monopolies to generate the wealth that paid the military specialists.
They're essentially buying off the military class.
The general looks at the math and says, do I launch a coup, risk a horrific war, and maybe end up with my head on a spike? Or do I sit back, enjoy my massive estate, and collect my monopoly profits from the temple grain silos?
The math heavily favors peace.
But, and I think this is important, we shouldn't confuse stable with static, right?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Natural states are dynamic, deeply unstable entities. Think about everything that can change in a pre-industrial society.
Like a drought.
A multi-year drought wipes out the agricultural surplus, or a neighboring empire invades,
Hmm?
or, more simply, new military technology is introduced.
Oh, let's go back to our mafia table analogy for that. What happens if a low-level enforcer suddenly gets his hands on a shipment of fully automatic weapons while everyone else still has revolvers?
His violence potential just skyrocketed.
So according to the logic of the double balance, he is going to walk into that sit-down and demand the casino contracts.
Exactly. His military muscle has increased, so his slice of the economic pie must increase proportionally, or he will start shooting.
That is exactly what happens when a medieval baron acquires a larger cavalry, or a tribal leader secures a new iron mine. They march to the dominant coalition and demand more writs.
And this is why the history of the natural state is a history of constant, low-level internal conflict. The distribution of privileges must continually be renegotiated to reflect the shifting balance of power.
It's exhausting.
It is. If the existing elites miscalculate, if they refuse to give that medieval baron more land because they underestimate how good his new cavalry is, the negotiations break down.
You get a civil war.
A civil war, a dynastic struggle, a coup. The dominant coalition must ruthlessly and continuously weed out members who have lost their military edge and incorporate new members who have gained one.
So this highly cynical, deeply practical system of using economic corruption to pacify warlords is the default setting for civilization.
It's how humanity survived the irritation coefficient.
But clearly not all natural states are identical. Some are chaotic warlord fiefdoms, and others are massive sprawling empires like Rome or the Han Dynasty with incredibly complex legal codes.
Right, and the authors address this by mapping out a spectrum of natural states, categorized by the sophistication of the organizations that the state is capable of supporting.
They break it down into fragile, basic, and mature natural states.
Let's start with the fragile natural state.
Okay, this sounds like the absolute bare minimum required to avoid total anarchy.
It really is. In a fragile natural state, the dominant coalition can contain the violence, but the arrangement is incredibly precarious.
How precarious.
Well, the defining characteristic here is that all politics is real politics. Meaning, if you make a political miscalculation, you don't just lose an election or your job.
You lose your life.
You lose your life. The state is not an abstract institution. It is simply a network of highly personal patron-client relationships.
So the identity of the state is completely inseparable from the physical bodies of the people currently in charge.
Exactly. A powerful warlord or patron offers physical protection to his clients, and in return, those clients provide him with resources, taxes, and military backing.
And if the patron dies?
The entire network shatters, and a new one has to be violently forged.
The book uses early medieval Europe as the primary case study here, specifically the Salic codes of the Franks from around the 6th century.
The Salic law is a fascinating look at how a fragile natural state attempts to document its violence management.
When you read it, it is jarring because it doesn't resemble modern justice in the slightest.
No, there are no abstract principles of right and wrong, no equal protection under the law.
It reads like a bizarrely specific price list. I actually have some of the prices here, and it's wild.
Please share them.
Okay, so if you steal a castrated pig, the fine is 15 solidi. If you shoot a man with a poisoned arrow and somehow miss, it's 35 solidi. If you kill a freeborn girl, it's 200 solidi. But get this, if you kill a count, like a member of the high-ranking elite, it will cost you 600 solidi.
And that disparity is the entire point.
It's not about justice at all.
No, the Salic Code perfectly illustrates the natural state's obsession with personal identity and elite privilege. The law explicitly assigns wildly different financial values to human lives based entirely on their social status and, by extension, their capacity to unleash retributive violence.
So the law isn't trying to punish evil, it's trying to find the exact market price required to stop the Count's family from burning your village to the ground.
Precisely. It is a mechanism to substitute financial compensation for retributive violence, keeping the fragile coalition from tearing itself apart over an insult or a stolen pig.
So how does a society evolve from pricing out castrated pigs into what they call a basic natural state?
The transition to a basic natural state happens when a society manages to develop durable public institutions.
Like bureaucracies.
Yes, administrative structures that can actually survive the death of a specific leader.
That's a huge step up.
It is. However, the crucial limitation is that these institutions only exist within the framework of the state itself. The state becomes a stable organization, but it absolutely refuses to allow powerful private organizations to exist outside of its direct control.
The authors point to the Aztec Empire in the 15th century and the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne in 8th century Europe.
Both are textbook basic natural states. They emerged from highly fragmented, chaotic environments and successfully built massive public institutions.
They had sophisticated administrative bureaucracies, organized taxation, state-sponsored religions, massive standing armies.
But if you were an elite in Aztec society or Carolingian Europe, and you wanted to organize something complex, say a large trading expedition, a new temple, a major agricultural project, you had to use the state's apparatus to do it.
You couldn't just start a private company.
No, because society was fundamentally a single, massive, state-run hierarchy.
Which naturally leads us to the final stage of this evolution, the mature natural state. If the basic state controls everything, what makes the mature state different?
A mature natural state reaches a level of institutional sophistication where it can support and protect private, elite organizations outside the immediate framework of the state.
So the king feels secure enough in his power that he can look at his nobles and say, okay, I will allow you to form your own independent courts, your own economic guilds, your own trading companies, and I promise the state won't just arbitrarily crush them or seize your assets.
Exactly. It requires a tremendous leap in legal sophistication.
You need a real legal system.
Yes, you need a well-articulated body of public law to govern the state's own offices, but you also need a developing body of private law to govern the contracts and relationships among the elites themselves.
And the book uses medieval England and France from roughly the 16th to the 18th centuries as the example here.
They spend a significant amount of time unpacking English land law to illustrate this, specifically focusing on a transition known as bastard feudalism.
Okay, we have to talk about bastard feudalism. First of all, incredible name.
It is a memorable term.
It sounds like an insult hurled across a medieval battlefield, but it was actually a massive institutional innovation.
It was a profound shift in how power and land were organized. Under classic early feudalism, the king granted vast tracts of land to his top nobles, the tenants-in-chief.
But this grant was deeply personal, right?
Very personal.
Yeah.
In exchange for the land, the noble owed the king personal military service. When the king called, that specific noble had to physically show up with a specific number of armed knights and fight for a set number of days.
So the military and the economy were literally the same thing. The land was the army.
Exactly. It was a purely personal physical obligation. But as English society matured and warfare became more complex, this system became highly inefficient.
I'd imagine.
I mean, you can't run a long multi-year campaign in France if your knights are legally allowed to go home after 40 days.
Right. So society shifted to bastard feudalism, where those personal military obligations were increasingly replaced with monetary payments.
The nobles essentially started paying a tax shield money, or scutage, instead of bringing knights. And the king takes that cash and just hires professional mercenary armies.
And while that sounds like a simple administrative tweak, it had earth-shattering consequences for property rights.
It really did. By severing the direct link between military service and land ownership, property began to depersonalize.
The land was no longer strictly tied to the military utility of a specific lord.
Right. It allowed the elites to buy, sell, and inherit land much more easily and securely, using the king's courts to enforce their complex contracts and trusts.
But, and this is the crucial caveat that we absolutely cannot lose sight of, it was still a natural state.
Yes.
The king's courts, these new secure property rights, the ability to form trusts, all of these incredible innovations were strictly reserved for the elites, the freeholders.
The massive peasant class, the villains, were completely locked out.
Well, they were still subject to the arbitrary customary law of the local manor lord. The elites built a brilliantly secure, complex, legal playground for themselves, but they kept the door firmly bolted shut behind them.
Because if they opened the door, they would lose their rents, and the entire system of pacification would collapse.
And I think it's vital to pause here and connect this historical deep dive to the present moment.
It's very relevant.
When we discuss fragile, basic, or mature natural states, we are not just doing a historical postmortem on the Aztecs or the Plantagenets. The authors estimate that roughly 85% of the global population today still lives in some spectrum of a natural state.
85%.
That means billions of people right now are living in systems where access is intentionally limited, where the economy is explicitly manipulated to serve the political survival of a dominant coalition.
And where your personal connections to power are vastly more important than what the law actually says on paper.
Yes, the natural state is not a relic of antiquity. It is the dominant, mathematically proven default method for human beings to organize a large society without falling into endemic violence.
So if 85% of the world is operating on this mafia truce logic, what exactly is happening in the other 15%?
Right. How did a radically new system manage to emerge from this historical straitjacket just 200 years ago?
This is where the framework pivots to the modern developed world, what they call the open access order.
The open access order is the water that we in the developed West swim in. And because it's all we know, we tend to blindly assume it is the natural endpoint of human progress.
But historically, it is a radical, unprecedented, and highly delicate institutional mutation. It only really began to emerge in the mid-19th century.
And the fundamental logic of the open access order is the exact inverse of the natural state.
Completely backward.
The natural state limits access to create rents to pacify warlords. The open access order relies on impersonality, open entry to organizations, and a widespread competitive sharing of economic gains.
The entire mechanism for controlling violence flips. In an open access order, the state achieves what sociologists call a Weberian monopoly on violence.
Meaning, the military and the police are fully consolidated into a single organization.
And critically, that organization is entirely subservient to the political system.
But wait, if the political system controls a massive consolidated army, what stops the political leaders from just becoming a new dominant coalition and using that army to oppress everyone and hoard all the wealth?
That is the genius of open entry, because economic and political access is guaranteed to everyone, not just elites. If a political faction attempts to abuse its control of the military, the broader society has the tools to peacefully mobilize.
They can form opposition parties, fund independent media, organize labor unions,
And ultimately vote the abusers out of office.
yeah.
The massive web of independent organizations acts as a permanent check on state power.
The economic data the authors use to illustrate the difference between these two worlds is absolutely fascinating. They pull from the Penworld tables, analyzing economic growth in rich countries, the open access orders, versus poor countries, the natural states.
And intuitively, you would assume that rich countries got rich because their economies just grow faster every single year.
A compounding advantage.
That is the intuitive assumption, but the data proves it entirely wrong.
Really?
Yes. When the authors looked at good years, years where a country experienced positive economic growth per capita, the rich countries actually grew slower than the poor countries.
Wow.
Rich countries, defined as those with incomes over $20,000 per capita, averaged about 3.88% growth in good years. Poor countries averaged 5.35%.
So when the track is clear and the weather is good, the natural states are actually sprinting faster. They're growing their economies at a higher rate.
But here's the secret sauce, the true superpower of the open access order.
It's what happens when things go wrong.
Yes. In the bad years, when negative economic shocks hit, rich countries shrink by an average of 2.33%. Poor countries shrink by a devastating 4.88%.
So the secret to long-term wealth isn't growing faster, it is shrinking less.
Exactly. Natural states are inherently brittle. Because they rely on a delicate balance of rents to satisfy elites, a sudden negative shock, a bad harvest, a collapse in global commodity prices, a succession crisis can shatter the dominant coalition.
The elites start fighting over a shrinking pie.
The violence breaks out, and the economy collapses. Open access orders avoid these massive negative growth episodes because they are incredibly resilient to shocks.
And that resilience is driven by a concept the authors call organizational density. In a natural state, forming an organization is a rare privilege guarded by the elites.
But in an open access order, it is a fundamental right available to anyone with a few dollars and a pen.
The contrast in the data is just stark. Poor countries average about 2.8 formal organizations per million people. Rich countries average 64 formal organizations per million.
Just to ground that in reality, the source notes that the United States has over 1.1 million tax-exempt nonprofit organizations alone.
That doesn't even count the millions of for-profit corporations, LLCs, Local school boards, bowling leagues.
Neighborhood associations.
Right.
We live in a society absolutely teeming with overlapping organizations.
And this organizational density creates a phenomenon that Friedrich Hayek and Douglas North call adaptive efficiency.
Because citizens can freely and easily form organizations, the society as a whole can rapidly adapt to random, unpredictable shocks.
When a crisis hits, say, a global pandemic or a financial meltdown, you don't have to wait for a centralized dominant coalition to figure out a solution.
No, millions of independent organizations are simultaneously experimenting with different solutions on the ground. The bad ideas fail quickly, and the good ideas scale up.
The authors apply the economic concept of Schumpeterian creative destruction, where new innovations constantly destroy outdated industries, and they apply it to politics as well.
Exactly. Political parties and policies are subject to the same ruthless competition as businesses. If a policy fails, a new political organization can freely form to offer a better one.
I have to push back here, though.
Oh, go for it.
Because this sounds incredibly utopian, and we know our current systems have massive flaws. If we look at the work of Mancur Olson, specifically his famous book, The Logic of Collective Action, he argued that over time, stable societies naturally accumulate special interest groups.
Corporate lobbyists, massive labor unions, industry cartels.
Right. And Olson argued that these groups eventually choke the economy to death by extracting rents and demanding special favors from the government. He basically theorized that all these organizations eventually act as parasites that drag down democracies. How does this framework counter Olson's pessimism?
It is a fantastic critique, and the authors tackle Olson's theory directly. They argue that Olson fundamentally missed the crucial difference in the environment. He missed the difference between a natural state and an open access order. Well, yes, in a natural state, a special interest group can extract permanent, society-choking rents because the state explicitly prevents anyone else from organizing and challenging them. The monopoly is enforced by law.
Ah, so it's a playing field issue.
Precisely. Rent-seeking absolutely still exists in open access orders. Corporations spend billions lobbying for tax breaks or favorable regulations. But because entry to the market and politics is open, those rents act as a beacon.
They attract aggressive competitors.
Yes. If a specific industry secures a massive government subsidy and starts making excess profits, new entrepreneurs will freely form corporations to enter that industry, grab a piece of the pie, and eventually compete the monopoly rent away.
And politically, if a special interest group pushes a policy that actively harms the public has the organizational tools to fight back.
They can form a PAC, organize a boycott, or fund a primary challenger.
The constant chaotic churn of Schumpeterian creative destruction prevents any one group from locking in permanent dynastic rents. Okay, this all sounds like the promised land of human organization. Wealth, peace, resilience, freedom, which leads to the most critical, burning question of this entire deep dive.
The transition.
Right. If the natural state is the historical default and it relies on powerful elites aggressively hoarding privileges to survive, how on earth does a society actually make the leap to open access? Why would a dominant coalition ever voluntarily dismantle its own monopolies?
That is the ultimate question of political economy, and the authors are unflinchingly realistic here. The transition cannot be a leap of faith.
It's not driven by a sudden moral awakening.
No. Elites do not sit around reading Enlightenment philosophy and suddenly decide to be altruistic. The transition must initially serve the naked self-interest of the natural state elites themselves.
The transition has to make sense within the logic of the mafia truce.
Exactly. A natural state must first organically arrive at what the authors call the doorstep conditions.
The doorstep conditions.
Yes. These are three highly specific, incredibly difficult institutional changes that allow elites to start interacting with each other impersonally. Once a society crosses this doorstep, the transition to open access becomes possible.
Though it is still not inevitable.
Not inevitable, but possible.
Let's break down these three doorstep conditions in detail, because this is the actual blueprint. Condition 1 is the rule of law for elites.
In a standard natural state, privileges are unique and deeply personal. The king grants Lord John a specific tax exemption because Lord John saved his life in battle.
It's a personal favor.
Exactly.
Sure.
To reach the doorstep, the elites must transform these unique personal privileges into shared, impersonal rights among the entire dominant coalition. Instead of relying on the king's personal favor, the elites negotiate a standardized set of laws that protect all elites equally.
And they do this not out of fairness, but out of fear. They realize that a fickle king could easily turn on them tomorrow.
By creating a standardized rule of law for themselves, they make their own property and their own heads much more secure. They take the first critical step toward impersonal relationships.
Which brings us to doorstep condition 2, which is historically one of the hardest to achieve.
Perpetually lived organizations in the public and private spheres.
Meaning creating institutions that outlive their human founders.
Yes.
Why is that so difficult? We form corporations today that last for centuries.
Because in a fragile or basic natural state, everything is tied to the physical bodies of the leaders. If the warlord dies, his treaties die with him. The alliances collapse, and a new network has to be forged, usually through a bloody succession crisis.
So to get to the doorstep, society has to figure out how to give an organization a legal identity that is entirely separate from the mortals who currently run it.
The book mentions that the Roman Empire, despite all its legal brilliance, completely failed at this.
Really? The Romans.
The Romans had highly advanced legal concepts and early forms of corporate bodies, but they could never successfully separate the abstract concept of the state from the personal, physical identity of the emperor.
So when an emperor died or was assassinated,
The ultimate source of law was thrown into jeopardy. Every succession was a potential crisis. The true, lasting breakthrough for perpetual organizations actually happened in medieval Europe.
this involves the legal concept of the king's two bodies, right?
Yes, it is one of the most brilliant legal fictions ever invented. Legal scholars and theologians in Europe developed the concept that the king actually possessed two bodies.
His mortal physical body, which would inevitably get sick and die, and his eternal political body, the crown, which never died.
The king is dead, long live the king.
Precisely. That phrase isn't just a royal cheer, it is a profound legal statement of perpetuity.
It allowed the state to make credible long-term commitments. A massive debt owed by the mortal king transferred seamlessly to the next king because the debt was technically owed by the eternal crown.
That's a massive shift.
And this perpetual life was also extended to the church, to universities, and eventually to elite commercial organizations like the East India Company.
Which leads us to doorstep condition 3, consolidated political control of the military.
In a typical natural state, military power is dispersed. Every lord has his own knights, every regional governor has his own militia.
To reach the doorstep, a society must consolidate all of that fragmented military power into a single national organization, a standing army or navy.
And that military must be controlled by a political body, rather than a single military dictator.
The sources reference Charles Tilly's phenomenal book, Coercion, Capital, and European States, to explain exactly why this happened.
It wasn't because European elites suddenly wanted to invent modern democracy.
No. It was driven by the terrifying, brutal realities of the military revolution in early modern Europe.
The military revolution fundamentally altered the economics of survival. The introduction of highly trained, drilled infantry, heavy siege artillery, and the Trace Italian, the low, thick, star-shaped forts designed to absorb cannon fire, meant that warfare became astronomically expensive.
Let's expand on those star forts for a second, because the mechanism is fascinating. Before cannons, a king could just ride up to a rebellious lord's castle, wait a few weeks, or knock the high, thin walls down.
But a star fort's angled earthworks absorbed cannonballs.
Suddenly, taking a city required a massive multi-year siege. You had to feed, clothe, and pay a massive standing army for years at a time.
And that required a level of funding that medieval agricultural taxes simply could not provide. The kings were going bankrupt.
So what did they do?
The elites realized that the only way to generate enough wealth to survive this new era of hyper-expensive warfare was to stop arbitrarily robbing the merchants in the cities.
They needed the merchants to get rich so the king could tax them.
Exactly. They needed to protect capital so that it would compound and grow. So the elites consolidated the military to survive existential external threats, and they granted secure, perpetual property rights to economic elites to fund that military.
It was a desperate survival strategy.
But it accidentally laid the institutional foundation, the doorstep, for open access.
It is an incredible irony of history. The elites build a highly secure, rule-based playground exclusively for themselves just to survive the military revolution.
They establish the rule of law for themselves, they invent perpetual corporations, and they consolidate the army under political control.
But once they build that doorstep, how does the door actually swing open to the masses? This brings us to the transition proper.
The transition proper is the final, remarkably rapid stage where those elite rights are universally extended to the general citizenry. Historically, this occurred over a fairly brief window, roughly between 1800 and 1850, primarily in Britain, France, and the United States.
But what is the trigger? If I am a wealthy elite securely enjoying my exclusive perpetual rights, why do I suddenly decide to let the peasants and the working class into the club?
It happens when the elites realize that it is actually safer to secure their own privileges through formal, universally applied institutions than through the constant, fragile backroom bargaining of the natural state.
So it's still self-interest.
Absolutely. They realize that if they create a system where anyone can freely form an organization, they themselves are protected if they ever end up on the losing side of a political battle.
The key mechanism that authors highlight here is the invention of general incorporation laws. And I think this is massively underappreciated in history classes.
It is perhaps one of the most important economic and political innovations of the modern era.
Because before general incorporation laws, if you wanted to form a business corporation, build a bridge, or start a bank, you couldn't just fill out a form.
No, you needed a special royal charter or a specific act passed by the legislature. It was a rare, highly lucrative privilege granted almost exclusively to political cronies.
It was pure rent-seeking. And we saw this in early American history, where political factions would fight viciously over who got the charter to build a canal or a bank, because whoever got it had a legal monopoly.
But eventually, the political fighting over these charters became so intense and so destabilizing that the elites sought an economic solution to a political problem.
They passed general incorporation laws.
These laws established standard administrative procedures where anyone, regardless of their political connections, who met basic financial criteria, could simply file paperwork and create a corporation.
Instead of fighting endless political battles over who gets the special charter, they just threw the floodgates wide open.
They democratized the tools of organization. But to do this, they had to overcome a massive ideological hurdle, what the authors call the fear of faction.
This is a huge theme in early American history. If you read James Madison in the Federalist Papers, the Founding Fathers were terrified of faction.
They viewed political parties and special interest groups as a cancer that would inevitably tear the young republic apart.
Because they viewed factions through the lens of a natural state, right?
Yes, where a faction is just a coalition trying to seize control of the state to extract rents and oppress its enemies.
But what Madison and the others eventually realized, and this is the core brilliance of the open access order, is that in a system of open access, the best way to prevent tyranny is not to ban factions, but to encourage a massive proliferation of competing factions.
If everyone has the right to form a corporation, a union, or political party, they naturally check and balance each other.
The elites finally opened access because they discovered that a highly competitive, rules-based system with a loyal political opposition was infinitely more stable and prosperous than a system of shifting alliances, where losing an election might mean being exiled or executed.
Think about this the next time you go online to register an LLC for a side hustle, or sign a petition, or vote for an opposition candidate.
200 years ago, you would have needed to personally know the king or bribe an entire state legislature to get access to those tools.
Those rights were originally aristocratic privileges, hoarded to prevent warlords from killing each other. They were opened up to you because a group of elites realized that sharing those tools made their own lives safer and their economies vastly wealthier.
It represents a profound tectonic shift in human identity. In the span of a few decades, individuals went from being deeply personal subjects tied to a specific patron to being impersonal citizens endowed with universal rights.
Which leads us to a deeply sobering question, a question that challenges the entire modern global order.
If we know this formula, if we possess the exact historical blueprint showing that open access brings unprecedented peace, immense wealth, and resilience, why can't we just export it?
Right. Why can't we just give this blueprint to the 85% of the world still trapped in natural states?
This is where the authors pivot to a very sharp, meticulously analytical critique of modern foreign policy and international economic development.
The standard playbook for institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, or Western governments when dealing with struggling, developing nations is to demand immediate structural reforms.
They say, deregulate your economy, secure private property rights, hold free and fair elections, and dismantle your state monopolies.
It sounds like fundamentally good advice. It's exactly what worked for the developed world.
But the authors say it is terrible advice for a natural state.
It is fundamentally flawed because it completely ignores the underlying survival logic of the society it's being applied to. These developing nations are not broken open access orders. They are functioning natural states.
Let's unpack this carefully, maintaining absolute neutrality on the politics of foreign intervention, because the mechanics here are devastating. You are saying that the monopolies, the crony capitalism, the corruption, those are essentially the load-bearing walls of a natural state.
Exactly. Their very ability to prevent endemic violence, warlordism, and civil war relies entirely on rents. It relies on the very monopolies and elite privileges that the West is demanding they destroy.
If an outside force, whether it's an international bank or a military intervention, demands that a natural state dismantle its monopolies and open its markets to free competition, they are demanding the destruction of the economic rents.
And those rents are the only thing paying the military elites to not use violence.
So forcing good, open market economic policies onto a fragile natural state doesn't magically create a prosperous democracy. It destroys the mafia truce.
It can literally spark a civil war. The tragic irony is profound. By trying to force economic efficiency, you destroy the political balance.
It's like buying an old crumbling house and deciding you want a modern, open floor plan. You take a sledgehammer and start knocking out the load-bearing walls because they look ugly and obstruct the view.
But you didn't bother to put in steel support beams first. The house doesn't become a modern loft. It collapses and crushes you.
And the steel support beams are the doorstep conditions.
Yes. Until a society has organically developed the rule of law for elites, perpetually lived organizations, and consolidated political control of the military, it simply cannot survive the pressures of open access.
We constantly make the mistake of assuming that these governments are just like ours, but poorly managed. We assume they possess a Weberian monopoly on violence.
But the authors point out that in many developing nations, the state is not a unified entity with a monopoly on force. It is just a fragile coalition of heavily armed factions wearing matching uniforms.
If you remove the economic glue holding that fragile coalition together by demanding free trade and deregulation, the factions go right back to the battlefield to secure their interests.
You cannot export the institutions of open access to a natural state and expect them to function the same way. Take elections, for example. We view elections as a sacred mechanism for holding leaders accountable to impersonal laws.
But in a natural state, an election is often just a census of violence potential.
It is a tool for patrons to demonstrate how many clients they can mobilize, essentially proving to the other elites that they have the numbers to win a civil war if one breaks out. It is a show of force, not a democratic mandate.
That reframes everything. It completely changes how you look at the evening news when a foreign intervention goes wrong or a newly democratic nation suddenly slides back into a military dictatorship.
It provides an incredibly clear, if highly sobering, lens through which to view global conflicts. The transition to open access is an organic, multi-generational process. It is immensely difficult, and crucially, it must align with the self-interest of the elites within that specific local society. You cannot parachute it in.
So to bring all of these massive historical and economic concepts together in a comprehensive summary, human history is fundamentally defined by the endless struggle to control the primal threat of violence.
As populations scaled past the intimate bonds of hunter-gatherer bands, the irritation coefficient demanded new solutions.
For 10,000 years, the primary solution has been the natural state. It controls violence by granting the most dangerous elites exclusive economic monopolies, effectively buying their peaceful cooperation through a delicate double balance of power and wealth.
And then, relatively recently, the open access order emerged as a radical mutation. It controls violence not through elite monopolies, but through impersonal rights, the rule of law, and massive organizational competition, Schumpeterian creative destruction in both politics and economics.
But a society cannot simply jump from one to the other. The transition requires the painstaking development of the doorstep conditions, a light rule of law, perpetual organizations, and consolidated military control before those rights can safely be extended to the masses through mechanisms like general incorporation laws.
The final takeaway for you listening to this is to deeply realize how incredibly unique your daily reality is. The open access order you live in is not the historical norm.
It is not the default, inevitable setting of humanity. It is a highly specific, exceedingly rare, and delicate arrangement that depends entirely on our collective ability to maintain impersonal institutions, organizational density, and adaptive efficiency in the face of constant shocks.
It is a fragile achievement that requires constant maintenance.
It is fragile indeed. And that leaves me with a final, provocative thought to mull over, looking toward the future. We talked about how the European military revolution, the massive expense of artillery, star forts, and standing armies, forced elites to consolidate the military and secure property rights, which inadvertently paved the way for open access.
Right.
But look at what is happening to the economics of warfare today. As technology drastically lowers the cost of violence, giving small, decentralized groups access to asymmetric drone swarms, cyber warfare capabilities, and open source biological agents, the state's monopoly on violence is facing an unprecedented challenge from below.
It introduces a radically new kind of scalar stress to the system.
Exactly. Will the modern open access order be able to maintain its Weberian monopoly on violence when a handful of individuals with laptops and commercially available drones can inflict the kind of massive damage that used to require a national army?
Or will this new technological reality force us to retreat into a digital version of the natural state?
Will we be forced to rely on massive tech monopolies, new digital patron-client networks for our basic security and economic access? Think about that the next time you log into a walled digital ecosystem. We might just be laying the foundational bricks for the castles of a new feudal age.
It raises profound existential questions about whether open access is a permanent achievement of human progress or just a temporary 200-year phase in the ongoing evolution of social orders.
It brings us right back to the beginning. We like to think we have a clean x-ray of how the world works, that progress is a straight, unbroken line leading upward. But you look a little closer at the historical bones of civilization, and you realize the diagnostic landscape is vast, complex, and constantly shifting. We are all still navigating those deeply muddy waters.
And keeping our heads above those waters requires a ruthless, clear-eyed understanding of the specific institutions that are keeping us afloat.
I couldn't have said it better. We'll leave it there for today.
Yeah.